connected with this idea is Freud's project, which I would say has been at least equally influential compared to Nietzsche's influence, and both of them run very deeply, are profoundly implicated in the thought of any contemporary thinker. And what's important about Freud is, first of all, the splitting of the subject. Splitting of the subject into its component parts, the id, the ego, the superego, the idea, mechanisms of repression, all the systematic organization of the mind, the geography of the mind that Freud offers us, in addition to his sort of temporal morphology of desire, as desire follows a certain path in each of the individuals, which accounts, for example, why every young man must go through an Oedipal phase. There is a sort of shape to human desire, and the shape is defined by temporality and by the kind of biological facts underlying our psychic life. The result of this, the splitting of the subject, is that introspection is deprivileged. Back in the time of Descartes, you knew what was going on in your head. You just looked inside and you told people. With Freud, another of the masters of distrust, a master of suspicion, like Nietzsche, he said, "Are you so sure that you know yourself? Are you really so transparent? Perhaps you've been creating illusions for yourself at the same time you were creating illusions for other people." The importance of Freud's work, and of course it's multivalent in many respects, but one of the leading elements in this that's been so influential in the contemporary world is Freud's interrogation and his suspicion about the manifest content of language, of communication. This makes communication problematic. And what we need then is some set of rules which allow us to move from surface meaning to the subsurface meaning, to find the ultimate reality which is disguised in the process of communication, systematically disguised. So what's important about Freud is that he has made the process of communication much more problematic and difficult than it had been in earlier philosophical times. The 20th century is particularly the age of incomplete, fragmentary, and uncertain communication. And may I suggest that this uncertainty of communication, this fragmentation of knowledge, this dissolution of the centripetal forces which hold society and thought and the self together, have generated a fragmentation of the self and a fragmentation of society which seems to preclude continuous, completely coherent discourses about either the self or the world that's experienced by the self. And this is isomorphically represented in the fragmentation of knowledge in the contemporary world. In other words, the postmodern idea that there can be no overarching, legitimizing meta-narratives is a way of gesturing at the fact that we are no longer whole selves. We are fractions of interiority. We are the debris of parts of a self. We cannot form a fully transparent Cartesian cogito because we cannot get that Delphic self-knowledge, ultimately, that Socrates was searching for. And if you can't know yourself, as Socrates would be more than happy to point out, it is going to be that much more difficult to know the external world. It will turn out that the external world is just as fragmentary and incomplete as partial as you are, and that there will be a direct isomorphism between the one and the other. So the idea then that knowledge is intrinsically partial, fragmentary, distorted, and uncertain means that our knowledge of ourselves is correspondingly distorted, fragmentary, and uncertain. And I believe that since the world, I am told, is constituted socially, is constructed in language, since our language is only fragmentary and partial and incomplete, so is the thing which it describes, since language constitutes it. And that means that you're just pieces of potentially part of a self, but we don't have quite what it takes to be a self anymore. Naturally enough, we find this difficult to cope with, and naturally we are trying to find a way out of this labyrinth. One of the difficulties that postmodernism offers us is the proposition that it may be impossible. As Barth said, this may not be a labyrinth, this may be home. So get used to it, make the best you can of it. Now, in addition to the fact that post-World War II intellectual life is conducted in the shadow of Freud and Nietzsche, I would be inclined to say that we have a new set of problems. We have old problems too. Some of accessible to a vast variety of people. This videotaped lecture series being a very good example of the proliferation and the increasing complexity of communication systems. And this offers us some benefits, surely. It offers the potential for an increased degree of human liberation, a decrease in toil and misery and unhappiness and perhaps pain. And that's the kind of, that's the optimistic or affirmative reading of these changes in technology, which have generated tremendous changes in society and in our theory of morals and our theories of politics. The pessimistic reading of technology, and particularly the technology of cybernetic information transfer, is much more typical of postmodern thinkers. Since the end of the Second World War, we have become increasingly anxious about the status of technology in our society because we feel perhaps that the tail is beginning to wag the dog, that it pushes us around much more than we use technology to push nature around. We feel constrained. We feel as though our options and our choices are being increasingly limited as our privacy is eroded, as more people can know more about us with greater ease, as the mechanisms of social control become progressively more effective or performative if they have more information. So for a great many reasons, the advent of communicative technology and cybernetic technology has been a bête noire, a big problem for contemporary postmodernist and post-structuralist thinkers. And technology connected with this generates a whole set of new problems that haven't been addressed yet and that we're just beginning to address and just beginning to think our way through. We're trying to work some of those out, but it will be another generation or 2 generations at least. In other words, there are plenty of unsolved, as a matter of fact, unasked questions about political theory which are connected to the advent of global technology. Some examples: global warming. Whose responsibility is the global degradation of the environment? We don't have a school of thought which gives a satisfactory answer to that, although it's a question that's going to become more and more important in the future, without any doubt. There's no way we can avoid that. A second set of questions connected with that is, suppose hypothetically, the biosphere, the simple biological limitations of the planet, impose certain limits to the degree to which we can have economic development, to the degree to which we can release fossil fuels, to which we can extend the ozone layer. Suppose, for example, it's not possible to develop the third world into something analogous to, say, Southern California. Suppose the simple limitations on the biosphere, on the atmosphere, and on the oceans won't allow for it. Suppose there are just too many people doing too much stuff to the environment. Suppose global warming would get too bad then. Does that mean we have to abandon the idea of equality, particularly insofar as it's connected with the equal distribution of wealth? As I understand it, one of the most important traditions in contemporary political thought is the idea of equality, particularly the idea of economic equality and the idea of equal or roughly equal distributions of property, which are usually entailed in discussions of justice. Well, suppose simple, brute, material reality prevents us from ever realizing that on a global scale. Does that mean that the redistribution of wealth, if that were to be a limitation intrinsically, does that mean that we have to reevaluate all our values? Or does it mean that the first world is going to vote to redistribute its wealth and cut back its income 50, 75%? A very difficult and intriguing set of moral and political problems is going to be generated by the increasing globalization of technology and by our increasing information about the influence this technology has on the atmosphere and on the environment. So the connection between increasing human capacities and a relatively shrinking domain of area, of space, of matter to exercise those capacities on may create a sort of antagonism between the two. And this may have tremendous repercussions for our conceptions of just political order and for our conceptions of political ideals. These ideas have just been touched upon, and they are likely to become main intellectual concerns of the next century. There is no way to avoid them. Now, technology, since the end of the Second World War, has been probably the most disputed terrain among those who work in political and moral theory. Start from the beginning and look at the most important of the post-World War II thinkers and see where they stand on technology, see if we can connect their views and see how one develops out of the other. Start with Martin Heidegger. Martin Heidegger is known for his critique of technological man. He says that technology is a distraction distraction, that gadgets pull us away from more authentic lives. We are, as T.S. Eliot put it, distracted from distraction by distraction. We are constantly being pulled from one sensation and novelty to another, but it prevents us from achieving authentic being and authentic meaning in our lives. There is a powerful element of technophobia here, and there is also a powerful element of resentment against the advent of postmodern technology. And we'll try and articulate the reasons why that might be the case when we look at a couple of other cases that fit in the same mold. The Frankfurt School, think of Marcuse or Adorno or Horkheimer or any of those social critics, extended the criticism of technology to its ideological manipulation of public opinion through the media of mass communications. So when Marcuse writes one-dimensional man, what he is saying to the world is that you people have been made one-dimensional by the fact that machines run you. You do not run machines. The tail has started wagging the dog. And if you would recapture your authenticity, if you would really become human again, you must break the bondage that you have to machines. They can no longer be the masters. They must be the servants. We cannot give mechanical reality. We cannot give technology a chance to become autonomous on its own. Now, Jürgen Habermas, who's one of the main extensions of the Frankfurt School, certainly the most important living exponent of that approach to the world, I think has moderated these claims into a much more reasonable and persuasive sort of a stance. Habermas points out that technology is potentially liberating if it is used in such a way as to extend the domain of communicative rationality to an enlarged speech community. And I think that there is a considerable justice in this observation. And let me make an analogy back to a novel to give the idea. If you think about 1984, I'm sure most of you have read it. Winston Smith is prey to technology. And George Orwell is very afraid of technology. Why? Because he thinks it crushes human freedom by giving the authoritarian state a chance for an oppressive surveillance 100% of the time. Now, think about how technology has in fact practically worked. The advent of something like the video camera. Instead of having the government install them in all of our bedrooms so that Big Brother can watch us, the video camera has been an enormously liberating tool in the hands of individuals. You can actually go out and tape the Rodney King beating, and for the first time, you can convict police officers and say that, yes, I have good, hard, fast evidence. And you know how I got it? Not from sharpening up my eyesight. I got it because I have technology, and technology is mass-produced to the point where certain private individuals can buy it and use it in anti-totalitarian, anti-oppressive ways. So I think that there is a considerable justice in Habermas's defense of the potentially liberating effect of technology, and I think that there are good practical reasons in the world around us to think that technology has been a double-edged sword, but those who are trying to throw technology out and call it into disrepute are in fact throwing the baby out with the bathwater. The idea of undermining the status of science and technology in society, I think, at this point in our historical development, is a sort of concession to the intellectual Luddites among us, to those who want to destroy the machines because it causes in them anxiety and worry and unhappiness, and they believe that the machines are the cause of this. The machines are the occasion of it, perhaps, but the machines are not the cause. The machines are the scapegoat for the fact that our self has become fragmented, that we do not know who we are because we don't even form a holistic unit anymore. The fragmentation of the self corresponds to the fragmentation of knowledge, and that corresponds to the fragmentation of society and the political wanted to live by this, it would mean that we would have to give an equality of funding and an equality of status to every kooky possibility. And I think that that would be a gross mistake. People will die if we fund Ouija board AIDS research. If we spend half our money on astrology and half our money on clinical trials, we will kill a lot of people with that sort of rejection of performativity. And it's impossible to convince me that that is simply an ideological construct, that that's an attempt to take serve to delegitimize all other alternatives. And once we've delegitimized all other alternatives, then we have room for the differon. And the differon demands that it be taken just as seriously as all these other alternatives. Now you want to ask yourself, who gains from this delegitimizing of science? Who gains from treating technology as oppressive and the state as illegitimate? Those who want to take control of the state, those who are the alternative ruling elite. Postmodernism is the ideology of intellectuals, humanistic intellectuals, who are saturated in their own resentment and who are frustrated by their inability to take political power. That's what postmodernism is. They use as a stalking horse their interest in the differond, in diversity. They're using that as a means to take control of the state. That is the real Nietzschean reading. And if they had the Nietzschean nerve of Foucault to say, I don't want to hear anything about this altruism. It really is about the will to power. I want to take control of the state. Power is its own end. Well, exists, a real cultural tradition, which exists independent of our feelings about it. It doesn't make us collapse back into solipsism. It rather gives us a sort of asymptotic job of continually renewing our connection to the cultural tradition. So I'd say that hermeneutics, in particular Gadamer and his and the results of his thinking, which I think is things like the communitarian political thought of people like Galston or Michael Sandel. I think that idea of recapturing a sense of community is one of the new and intriguing postmodern ideas in a way. It went around postmodernism, which may save it some time, because I suspect that 50 years from now, postmodernism will be a cul-de-sac, something no one reads anymore, and I'm not so sure that's a bad idea. Let me close up this discourse by looking at a few of the ironies of this negative antagonistic stance which humanistic intellectuals take towards technology, science, and the theory of knowledge. In the first case, it seems like the everyday practical world, and even perhaps not exclusively the everyday practical world, but sometimes the extraordinary parts and the extraordinary agents, the extraordinary people in the world, are blissfully unaware of the contemporary developments in intellectual life, and I think that may well be a good idea. I'm confident that intellectuals will resent that because they've adopted that as a sort of reflex rather than a kind of considered opinion. But the reason why I think that intellectuals are likely to resent their irrelevance is that when the contemporary world talks about important historical changes, important historical agents, they're virtue out of its own